Okay, so I assume everybody's here that wants to be here. This is our almost last session except the closing session. This is session 3B. For those of you, in case you're in the wrong room, we're going to be talking about migration risk and household outcomes. We have 3 papers in the program. We're going to go until 1 o'clock. It is somewhat important because we have a closing session afterwards. We don't have much slack, so I'm going to ask the presenters to be especially careful with the time. So the first presenter is Jasper Tjaden from the UN Migration Agency. And Jasper, you have, I would say, 18 minutes. So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Let me try to share my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see them. You can make them to the presentation format if you like, so they become bigger.
I thought they were already. Let's see.
So because we're also seeing the next slide.
Ah. Let's see. How about now?
Yeah, that should work if you give it a sec.
Yeah.
Yep. No, going back to the same thing.
Apologies.
No, then let's go ahead. It's fine.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, first things first, thanks to the organizers of this conference. I've hugely enjoyed it so far, and it's really an honor to have the opportunity to present here among this great group. So, and thanks to the chair as well for having me in this session. I will present on the role of information for the decision-making process of irregular migrants. This is work together with Felipe Dunch. Felipe used to be at the bank at the Development Impact Evaluation Unit there, and he's now with the World Food Program, coordinating different impact evaluations. I work for the IOM Global Migration Data Analysis Center. We're about 30 people out of Berlin. We're part of the IOM headquarters in Geneva, but yeah, based out of Berlin. We are tasked with making better use of the data that IOM is collecting and also providing more hard evidence on the impact of different programs and projects that we implement. So one of the fields where we started doing this is evaluation of awareness raising campaigns that IOM is implementing across the globe. Right. First, quick context for the study, first in terms of policy context and then in terms of the academic literature. Campaigns are a common tool in many fields. They're often used in health or education, and you've probably come across studies on effective awareness raising on immunization or fertility programs, returns to education, financial literacy. So they're quite common in other fields. Relatively new in the field of migration. But especially since 2015, there's been a large increase in funding for information and awareness raising campaigns targeted particularly at potential migrants, especially in Africa. The rationale behind these programs is the idea that potential migrants often lack accurate information and fall victim to misinformation by smugglers. So they often have biased information about the journey that's ahead, about the modalities of the journey, but also life at destination and so forth. There is ample documentation of exploitations of migrants and suffering of regular migrants, particularly in Libya over recent years, but also broad evidence of exploitation crossing the desert, crossing the Mediterranean, or in Italy. Colleagues in our center actually count the missing migrants that, migrants that go missing and migrant deaths every year. A very, very depressing project, but very important one. So we have large evidence of that. Now, before we started this program, looking at the impact of awareness raising campaigns, we did a systematic literature review, and maybe unsurprisingly, we found very little robust evidence on the effectiveness. Most studies that are out there are usually very small N studies, mostly qualitative work that looked into small-scale campaigns. Now, in terms of context from some of the academic literature, while the concept of risks, the topic of many of the awareness-raising campaigns that are underway, is all over the migration literature, of course, particularly in the field of economics. But its role is often sort of not directly operationalized or directly modeled. It's just implicitly assumed or discussed or often lumped into some broader cost parameter, but not sort of explicitly modeled. Now, also many economic models that I've come across usually lump in regular and irregular and don't distinguish the two necessarily. But of course, the dynamics for irregular migration could be quite different, particularly with regards to the policy environment. Many studies that we found use macro level data, and it's harder because of the lack of availability of data to narrow down sort of the decision-making process at the micro level, particularly in regards to irregular migration. Some of the work, especially in the field of sociology, is quite critical of information treatments because campaigns are largely seen as ineffective. There's this claim that migrants already know everything about the journey. They're well informed, but they go anyway, so they're not sensitive to those risk information. However, there's also a few number of papers showing sort of the opposite effect, that information does matter for migration decisions in different contexts. It is still unclear, I would argue, how exactly sort of irregular migrants deal with risk and uncertainty involved in this very dangerous irregular migration journey. And luckily, there are a number of projects underway in addition to ours that are trying to uncover the processes. And some of these projects are by Ba and colleagues, and I'm happy that that Tijan will actually provide some comments to the presentation today. There's another team out of Berlin, Skako and colleagues, who are working on another fascinating study. So we're looking forward to the results coming out of those projects over the coming years. Now, quickly a word on campaigns. So there's a huge variety of different types of campaigns that are out there. And there are radio campaigns, TV campaigns, discussion events. There's a lot of activity online. There are billboard campaigns, online campaigns, and so forth. And it's important to highlight that many of them have very different goals. They have different messaging and different types of approaches. One approach that IOM embraced is working with returnees and migrants themselves that have experienced their migration journeys and are eager to sort of provide information to their peers once they return. There are also migrant associations in many countries formed, particularly now talking about West Africa. In a lot of countries, there are migrant associations of returnees that want to raise awareness about their particular journeys and the dangers involved to prevent harm for their peers. So the intervention that we were looking at in this particular paper is one of those peer-to-peer communication awareness-raising campaigns. This particular one took place in Dakar, Senegal, and we were able to implement a rigorous randomized controlled trial to look at the effects. Participants were invited to either participate in the IOM awareness-raising event, which screened a movie, which was a documentary displaying returnees being interviewed and talking very personally about their individual experiences along their journeys to Europe. Mostly the journeys, but also with some exceptions, their experiences in Italy. The control group events screened another movie, which was about Senegalese society and had no real relevance to that in terms of migration. Now, following the movie in both instances, there was a discussion and particularly after the discussion after the migration movie, where returnees engaged with their peers and had a face-to-face discussion among community members about their experiences, about information about migration, sharing information about the risks involved in their migration projects. Now, our two main research questions were, does participation in those awareness-raising events induce an increase in subjective information level? So how well do potential migrants feel informed about their migration plans? What's their knowledge about migration and the risk perceptions, and also their intentions to migrate irregularly 3 months after participating in the project? And in some further analysis, we tried to tease out whether risks and knowledge, of the perceptions of risks and migration knowledge matter for the intention to migrate. The sample is as follows. As I said, we conducted the study in Dakar, Senegal. We organized 36 events where movies were screened and discussions were held in 8 different districts of Dakar. You see sort of a broad map here in the background. Subjects were recruited through random walks around the event locations. There were several screening questions to be able to participate, to be invited to attend the events. You had to be between 18 and 35. You had to report a general willingness to migrate within the next 2 years. And you had a general interest to show up to a movie event, which was, and all filter questions obviously were applied to both treatment and control. In total, we invited around 8,000 individuals. 1,400 showed up to treatment and control. As I pointed out, we had no clear sampling frame. We did random walks to recruit. The randomization did work out well. We were dealing with a balanced sample, but of course, a non-probability sample. The net sample that we used for the analysis were around 1,000 potential migrants that we were able to survey before the event, and then again 3 months later. We estimate a local average treatment effect. We don't really have an intention to treat effect because at the time of recruitment of the sample, we were keen to invite as many people as we could to ensure a large enough net sample that would actually show up to the movie. So we had just very few questions at the time of recruitment, 2 to 3 screening variables. And those people that were invited but did not participate in the actual event were not surveyed again at endline. So that's why we were not able to estimate any ITT. For the model, we just estimate an OLS model with various dependent variables. As I mentioned, self-perceived, self-reported, or subjective knowledge about migration, actual knowledge about migration, perception of risks, and intention to migrate irregularly. We use fixed effects at neighborhood level and clustered standard errors at the event level. We did a number of robustness checks, including, for example, a number of baseline controls, including baseline values of the dependent variables. We use different estimators, and we also use different ways of operationalizing the outcome variables. In the results that you see, we mostly use binary outcomes. We also, in the annexes, provide Likert scales. Right, so let's jump to the results. The short story is that we do find a number of fairly large and consistent effects. We find that participating in the awareness-raising events increased how well potential migrants feel informed by 20%. The risk perceptions of the journeys are increased by 25%. The intention to migrate irregularly is reduced by 20%. All of that is relative to the control group level. On the right-hand side, you actually see the effect sizes. We do not find any effects on actual knowledge gains in terms of factual knowledge relating to the number of recorded casualties, the asylum process, or accessibility and eligibility for work visas. However, we do argue that these do not play a major role in the movie. They are mentioned, but the main focus of the movie is on sort of fairly emotional portrayal and sharing of personal experiences, less on sort of factual treatment. We also find that risk perceptions matter more than other drivers for the intention to migrate irregularly. And this can be, this I'm showing here in this graph. So what drives irregular migration? We use sort of the intention to migrate irregularly as the outcome variable, and then net of a range of other factors. We looked at these five factors and checked whether they're related to an inclination to want to move. And we saw that the perceiving critically high risk involved in the migration journey reduces the intention to migrate irregularly. Conclusions. We interpret these results as sort of support for the claim that peer-to-peer information interventions can be effective. They can increase risk perceptions and reduce intentions to migrate irregularly. And we argue, or we speculate that this has a lot to do with sort of the particular peer-to-peer approach, which involves highly credible messengers that are from the local communities. In the messaging, there's no other actor involved there. It's a trusted environment, and that type of approach, we speculate, increases the identification with the messenger and actually allows the audience to, yeah, believe in the story and maybe apply the learnings from that session to their own situation rather than sort of gaining abstract knowledge that is not applied to their own context. We also find that risks matter for the decision-making process, and this is confirming results, recent results from other authors. Now, importantly, I want to mention certain limitations. The most interesting variable, maybe to some, is the intention to migrate irregularly. We do not have any measure for actual migration behavior, and I think that's what many projects are grappling with, that it's incredibly tricky to measure this at the micro level. Many try, and we're also trying at the moment, but it is tricky and it's not part of this study. However, there are lots of papers out there showing a fairly high predictive power of intentions for actual later behavior. Second limitation is we look at a fairly short-term time horizon. So we measure the end line at 3 months after intervention. And this was largely due to sort of resource constraints. We were surprised with the size of the effect, but it would be interesting to check sort of 6 months down the road, 9 months down the road, does any of this effect actually last? If we look at results from other information campaigns, it would be surprising if they did last to that extent, because usually they wane off in other fields. And another limitation, of course, is that we have a non-probability sample. The external validity is limited. Now, very briefly, in the minute and a half that I have left, I wanted to describe some of the next steps that we want to take with this paper. First, we want to do some cross-validation with another paper that is underway. We did a diff and diff in Guinea with a similar type of intervention, actually a mobile movie that went from village to village and organized events. We find some very similar results, which is reassuring, and we want to do more cross-validation in that regard. We also want to look further into sort of the causal pathway and maybe formalize a decision-making model, building on works of others like de Jong and others, and look at the relative importance of risk versus other factors. The IOM is currently, or particularly our center, is currently doing 5 more studies that all have the ambition to provide some causal evidence. And those will be conducted in 4 West African countries and in Ethiopia. And we hope to tackle some open questions with those. For example, how do we measure behavior? What is the role of the social network? How can we arrive at sort of greater external validity by using probability samples, but also just implementing the study, replicating the study in different contexts? And yeah, that is all for me. Thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion and the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasper. And so we are now ready for um, the discussion. And the discussant is Tian Ba. The floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you. It pleasure to discuss this paper. So I'll just share my presentations in a minute. I hope you are able to see this.
It's fine. You can move to the slideshow and maybe come a little bit closer to your microphone.
Okay.
This is perfect.
Are you getting me properly?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So yeah, it's a pleasure to discuss this very interesting and it's a nice contribution to the literature. So I will be quick and briefly summarize the paper. Basically, what the paper does, what the authors did in a very careful manner is to implement an RCT in order to measure the impacts of peer-to-peer information that conveys risk associated with irregular migration. And in particular, they did do screening of movie type that is being conveying information from testimonies of returnees, mostly on the negative experiences that these returnees went through when they are trying to migrate irregularly, and a control group in which they gave a placebo video. They saw a placebo video. So briefly, the results show that indeed being shown this video increase the risk awareness, subjective information levels, and importantly, it reduces the intention to migrate irregularly. So in terms of potential implications is that obviously there is a lot of information campaigns that are being done geared towards informing potential irregular migrants. And perhaps this would be a cheap way of not only informing people about the risks, but also trying to counter this misinformation that potentially comes from smugglers. So in terms of just a couple of suggestions and questions that I have in mind here is that when I went through the paper, I mean, even though it's focusing the study was done in Senegal, Dakar in particular, seems that there is some lacking discussion in terms of migration in general, and Senegal trying to motivate why you chose Dakar itself. Additionally, in terms of the testimony, so what is interesting is that the movie is not only, the testimonies are not only coming from Senegalese returnees, but also returnees from other countries, say Nigeria. So, so when we are thinking about trusting information, conveying credible information, we talk about how do people respond to this in terms of how do they relate to it, even though some of these returnees are from Senegal. So my question becomes, do you thought about the fact that maybe you are conveying mixed information, some coming from Senegalese and some coming from Nigeria? And another thing related to the movies, you did show the control group a placebo video. So I thought about the fact that this placebo video, even though you describe it in the paper, basically what I can understand is that the placebo movie convey some hardship and then just faced by Taliban. So Taliban, this for those of you who don't know, so these are people that learn mostly the Quran, and it's something that is very visible in the Senegalese context. So the question becomes, since this movie, even though it's a placebo, it doesn't in principle mention anything related to migration, whether it does convey additional information that is relevant to migration, because we're talking about irregular migration, the whole theme of exploitation, dangers, and so on is something that is preached, and it's something that is irregular migrants do face. And another thing, I mean, you talked about the movie mostly focus on negative experiences. So my question becomes, why do you think that's the only thing? Is it due to some kind of expectation, perhaps motivated that on positive side, people think everything is nice or not. Maybe there should be a discussion why you focus on this negative information. You already mentioned about outcomes being 3 months. Yeah, I wanted to understand, given the context in terms of the duration for measuring outcomes, just to make a brief comparison with what is known. Like for our context, you made mention that we are doing something very similar in the Gambia. So we're talking about an airline 1 year plus a couple of months. So just to make a comparison. So already you mentioned this in the limitations. You in terms of outcome is mostly intention or to migrate. So I don't know. In the conclusion of the paper, you talked about this is an avenue for research. But given what you already have, you did this nice RCT. Perhaps there is still a potential, given the existing data that you have, to try and understand more about what happens to actual irregular migration. And we're trying to do something similar for Gambia. We have this one follow-up surveys that is interesting to be able to learn actual outcomes, and something that we are also doing. It's to, I don't know whether you collected information on WhatsApp. This is something that perhaps might be useful for us to understand actual migration decisions within this context. Otherwise, that's it for me. Thank you very much. And it's a really nice paper. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple more minutes for questions. I don't know if anybody has a question, just raise your hand or barge in, feel free. Otherwise, I'm gonna give a couple more minutes to Jasper to respond, and then we will move to the next presentation. No? Okay, Jasper, if you would like to respond quickly.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks, Tijan, for all these helpful comments. Why Dakar? Well, that's where sort of the intervention was implemented. It was also implemented in other parts of the country and is now also implemented in other countries in West Africa. And choosing Dakar were purely sort of logistical reasons in the beginning. We wanted to have a proof of concept and a pilot study, and it had to be done fairly quickly and implemented fairly quickly. So that's why we started with Dakar. We will follow up with other locations, but we'll make sure to provide more sort of context information on the migration context, particularly in Dakar. This is the case that many move to the city and then to migrate abroad. You mentioned the testimonies of in the treatment, that they were mixed. They were not only Senegal. That is true. That was the case because at that point we didn't have enough testimonials just from Senegalese migrants. However, they all focus on the journey that went a similar route, so to say. So their experiences were similar. And we didn't see that. So if that caused an issue, maybe it would then reduce the effect rather than increase it. So maybe our effect size, which is estimate is conservative from that perspective. Same with the placebo movie. It does show hardships of what are basically hardship of street beggars in Dakar. There's no clear link to migration, but of course you could argue that seeing this hardship would want to make you migrate more rather than less. But if that was the case, you would also see sort of a reduction in our treatment effect, which maybe occurred, but again, then our estimate would be a conservative one. You also bring up sort of a normative question of why negative messaging and why negative experiences. At that time, the trial is already almost 2 years ago. At that time, the focus was very much on sort of preventing harm as a response to the horrible stories that all of us have seen on media, including footage of slave trades and so forth in Libya, and the mounting evidence of exploitation to the crudest form. So that was the first attempt to check that particular issue. Current campaigns and forthcoming campaigns are a lot more mixed. There will be information on legal alternatives, on local opportunities, on empowering potential migrants, sharing information about educational opportunities and so forth. So the narrow focus on risks was something that was the case a couple of years ago and is now becoming a little bit more rounded. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned the time trend. We had actually the similar idea. We're currently, actually next week, we're launching a phone survey with the full sample that we collected. Actually, we're combining samples from the Dakar study with the Guinea study. And luckily, we collected a lot of contact details there from, in total, 14,000 potential migrants. So we designed a phone survey study in combination with a WhatsApp study. We did a sort of another randomized approach where we try to figure out where we get better response rates. So we have a WhatsApp treatment, and then we have a audio message call treatment. And then we also vary the incentives that people get transferred to their mobiles to see where the response rates are higher. And on the one hand, we're interested, of course, whether people migrated or not, but we were also worried about getting enough responses from that survey, which is often a tricky issue with those phone surveys. That we were also including then so the question on what mode is best to engage with potential migrants a year and a half on. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, guys. So the next paper on the program is from Paris. We have Luis Becerra, and he's going to talk about Malawi. Luis, the
Hello.
floor is
Yes.
yours.
Can you hear me? Everybody can hear me?
We hear you well. Just need
Okay,
to hear presentation.
perfect. Okay. I'm going to share the presentation. Okay.
All right, that's good.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you so much for the accepting the paper and the conference. I'm very glad to be here. Today I'm going to present a paper that I'm working with my supervisor, Professor Catherine Milok, about gender and migration responses to drought in Malawi. Okay. Just to give you a small background, in the case of Malawi, 1.7% of the GDP is on average per year is lost due to droughts and floods, just to give you an idea about the impact these kind of environment phenomena. And in general, some rural households can adapt in the intensive margin, for example. In the intensive margin, they can try to adapt by getting insurance, for example, or drought-resistant seeds. But unfortunately, for countries like Malawi, this is not widely available in many areas. And on the extensive margin, people they can decide to adapt through migration. No? And in terms of the motivation that we have is the climate, we try to merge two literatures of the climate-inducing migration, and the other one related with marriage, child marriage. So in terms of the first one that is related with climate-induced migration, we have previous works on the case of Malawi, though, that they show that migration actually were reduced following rainfall shocks. And there is also an extensive evidence of climate-induced migration, but unfortunately there is less work on heterogeneous effects. Like, for example, in terms of wealth, there are some papers like Cataneo and Perry that they show the evidence of trap population at the country level or at the household level in the case of Henry. And however, there is no clear pattern with respect to the gender differences. In some papers, the Gray and Mueller, etc., they find that migration of women actually were decreased with droughts. And in other papers, in Gray and Mueller too, and in the case of Baez et al., for example, they find that actually war-related migration of women were increased following environmental change. So in terms of child marriage and the literature related with marriage, actually child marriage is a practice that is very prevalent in the sub-Saharan Africa. There are papers already going in this direction. And there is an emerging literature on the social consequences of bride price. If remember, bride prices can be seen as the husband pays a bride, it makes a payment to the daughter, for example, or they have to make a payment of the bride price. And unfortunately, the impact of droughts on child marriage depends on the, according to the paper of Cordon Buena, there are cultural practices are very important. So for example, you can find that drought increases the probability of child marriages in countries that use bride price custom, like the case of Malawi, while in other countries, drought actually decrease with respect to dowry. So that creates an effect in terms of the child marriage. And on the other, in the same line, adverse shocks, for example, during teenage years, have been increased with the probability of early marriage in the case of rural in Tanzania. That kind of go directly more in line with the result that we have in the case of Malawi. And marriage can be seen in papers like Rosenweider, for example, an arrangement to deal with locally covariant risks. For example, imagine that you have an effect at the district level, and then this is you have a drought, for example, and that create internal shock. So families can decide to send migrants abroad outside of the household in order to smooth consumption. You can, for example, you can see that they have a burden less, amount less to feed, for example. And the research question that we have is that I'm going to start to quote a bit of it that the bride price, for example, is an institution in which the husband gives a payment to the household of the daughter. And in the case of Malawi, this is called like a lobola in the north part of the country, and it's also found in the Nyakusa tradition in the Karonga district. In this tradition, they, instead of giving money, they can also give a loan to the family, or they can provide with a cow, for example, a way to pay for the daughter that they are taking. So in a country like Malawi, with a large share of rural migration and bride price institutions that I mentioned before, the question that arises is migration. There are migrations responses. The migration responses to drought differ between men and women, particularly at young age. And these particular migration responses are different for male-related moves compared to the war-related moves at different ages. In terms of the results, to give you an idea of the paper in the nutshell, so we find first, we go to the marriage-related migration, and we find that there are increases within district migration for women in older age, but we find hard to assert that there is a child marriage migration. In terms of the war-related reasons, we find that after severe droughts, there is increases in the probability of between district migration in young age categories, which can be seen as an exposed coping mechanism. So remember, marriage-related migration, it goes more directly to, like, is more in within district, while war-related is more prevalent in between district migration. And then when we combine both reasons and put them together, we find that some evidence of increase of migration for young girls after following a severe drought. How are we going to try to test this hypothesis? We are trying to, we are use the information of the LSMS, ISA, which corresponds to 4 waves, and we construct a retrospective panel from 2000 to 2015 at the level of migrant. So this is a very important information, a very rich information, because we have information at the individual level with information of in which the origin district when the migrant was living, to which district of migration they arrived, and the specific year when they migrated. So we're going to explore this kind of particular characteristic of the survey. And this is a representative survey at the national and literacy level. And just to give you a little bit of the information about the importance on migrants internal migrants in the country, we can see that in green in the table, the flows for between and within migrants are very important. There are just a small in blue migrants, international migrants. And also we are going to explore information about the reasons a state to migrate of type of migration. So we can find here the difference between and within. So the main reason to migrate is for family reasons that you can find here. And the second reason is for marriage. And the third most important reason in the case of Malawi is for work-related or looking for job, for works. And keep in mind that in the case of Marys, for example, there is a big part, or the majority, a much higher part of within district migrants. That's something that we have to keep in mind after. And we would like to use the information of the self-reported drought measure. This is information at the community level. But here I just want to give you an idea about the importance of droughts in the case of Malawi. So there are around 700 communities or enumeration areas, and in the year 2016, 2017, there were 544 that reported drought as a main problem in the community. So just to give you an idea that droughts are kind of a very important problem in the case of Malawi. As the information of the drought measure is reported is not very accurate, we prefer to construct our own measure using the standard precipitation index. This is a kind of measure that is coming from McKee and is calculated at the level of district using satellite images from SHERPs. And those are have a resolution of 5 kilometers and 5 kilometers at the equator, and this is monthly data. We don't adjust by temperature to construct a standard precipitation evaporation index because the temperature trends were rather stable for the country, so we don't control for this aspect. And this is just a map of the country and the standard precipitation index for the different districts. So you can see in higher values are associated with less rain, more rain, sorry. So you can find it here in blue, while negative values or in red are associated with less rain or drought. And we can see that there is a variation in this index at the level of district for the country. So the econometric specification that we are going to do is we are going to construct a retrospective panel and we are going to use a M that is going to be a dummy if the individual age of the category age A move in GRT from district or origin O to district of destination D. And we are going to interact, we are going to see the effect of the drought at the level of, there was a drought, for example, in the district O in GRT. So we are going to use the standard precipitation index to define if there was a drought or not in the district in GRT. And we are going to interact, make the interaction of the drought measure with the age A, which is the vector of 5 age brackets at the time of migration. And we control for years of schooling and sex of the migrant and the migration cost that is proxied by the distance from O to D. We also include some dummies for the time, the survey, the specific survey when they were collected. Origin district fixed effect, destination fixed effects, and some time fixed effects. And we also cluster the standard errors at origin district. In terms of the estimation method, what we are trying to do is a retrospective panel. So using the household and individual data only for the LSMS survey years. So this corresponds like a quasi-experimental design for the probability of individual migration by age group that are moving in GRT from district O to district D with and without drought. We try to do an estimation by OLS and PROVIT, but in the particular case of the OLS, we find very low explanatory power because it could be a potential bias or missing variables. So for that reason, we decided to use the OLS with interactive fixed effects that in this case is going to account for common correlated effects. So you can think, for example, about similar shocks or droughts in this particular case are going to have heterogeneous effect at the level of distance. So there are some districts that are more affected than others. So we are aiming to capture with this interactive fixed effect this kind of heterogeneity. We have some balance table for the control variable, but I'm going to skip for a matter of time. I'm going to go first with the result that we have for memory-related migration. So what we have here is we put all of them together, the between and within district migrants, only for women for now. The first two columns correspond to the result for the OLS interactive fixed effect, the second 3 and 4, the PROVIT marginal effect for the PROVIT. And here the first 5 lines corresponds to the standard precipitation index, the drought measure that we use it for interacted with the different age categories. The baseline age category is 48 to 57. And we have for the first line for moderate droughts, and -2 correspond to the interaction with extreme droughts. So what we find here is in M1, you can see here, is that for the reference age group, we found that migration actually is constrained by drought. In M2, if we add this coefficient here, for example, with the baseline category to have a net effect of age group to baseline, for example, we're gonna see some small increases for the older people. We can find it here and in this particular, in this part here for extreme droughts. And in M3, you can see that there are also small increases for the young in the marginal net effect. So you can make the sum between 0.0, this coefficient here with the coefficient here. So you have small increases. And then we move on, and then we restrict the sample for women moving for marriage, and we find similar results. So again, there are a small increase in marriage migration for those of more than 18 years. And in M5, we find that we are going to reject the hypothesis of marriage-related migration. Actually, you made the sum of the coefficient. This is negative. We're going to discuss later. And then we move on and we split the sample for between within district migrants, and we find similar results, that the results are mainly for within district migrants that you can have here, the net marginal net effects. However, there is a negative marginal net effect so the hypothesis that we have, this is potentially there are some marriage market equilibrium effects. So to summarize the results on marriage is that drought inhibits migration. There are changes in the probability to migrate after drought are larger for higher age bracket for within migration. There is no effect or a small effect for droughts on the marriage-related migration for the young categories. And marriage-related migration for women actually occurs more within district migration. And then let's move on to the work-related migration. So in the similar fashion, we use the first four columns for women and the other columns for men, for women and men, for those moving for working. And we find in W1 is that actually the net marginal effect is the work-related migration for young boys, and for young girls is positive. No? So we have an evidence here. And the within district results are omitted because there were no results. So to summarize the results for work-related migration, we find that there is an increase in men's and women's migration following severe drought, which correspond to marginal effect of 8.7 percentile points and 5.1 percentile points for women, but only for the young age category. Compared to the marriage-related migration, there is a between district rather than within migration, and child labor can be seen as an exposed coping mechanism of the drought. And then we decided to combine the marriage and work-related migration because I think probably some people are stating that marriage is also important, but they move for work, for example. And we find we split the sample for between and within, and women moving for marriage and work for both categories. And we find that only when we group the both categories, there is we find a sizable effect on migration for young girls. So we sum the both coefficient, and this one is positive of 2.23 percentile points. So the mechanism that we have in mind is that possible explanation is that in the case of the within migrants, there is a lower supply of men making bride price payments. So once you have a shock in the within district, there are less boys that are able to pay the bride price because all of them were affected by the drought, for example. There are some effect on bridal payments rather than migration for marriage. And for between district, the child migration can be seen as a coping mechanism to a smooth consumption. So in the between district, for example, if you have a shock, you might send your child outside of the district, and that is going to reduce in a way to smooth the consumption in the household. And is there a must-have safety net program? An effect on that, but there is the paper hit, and then they find no effect on food security of this particular program. Also, ethnicity can play a role, but we find that also this is less important for the case of Malawi compared to other sub-Saharan countries. And just
Luis, I will need to interrupt. You will have 1 minute. So
yes, I think I just have 2 slides more. I'm gonna finish.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we try to do some descriptive evidence on the consequences. And we find that actually the migrants for marriage were more likely to drop out. Once they move, for example, they are more likely to drop out than other migrants. Within district migrants, for example, are also more likely to be pregnant. And also the percentages for between district are also important, from 24%, and which is also very important. So once they migrate, those who migrated for marriage, 24 after moving, half of them are getting pregnancies. So to conclude, we've tried to link the literature of migration with the literature of marriage institutions as an evidence of gender-related differences. And second, we have small increases in marriage-related migration, but only at the within districts and for all their age groups. And we find hard to assert that child marriage migration. And for war-related reasons, we find that following severe drought, there are increases in the probability of between district migration and the young categories. We can be seen as an exposed copy mechanism. And finally, that one, by combining both reasons, we find some evidence that following severe drought, there is an increase of migration for young girls. Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Luis. And the discussant is Frederic Toquier. Frederic?
Yeah, can you hear me, Chala?
Yes,
Yes.
we hear you well. Luis, you need to stop sharing. So, Frederic, I don't know if you have slides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So it was a pleasure to discuss this paper, Luis. I enjoyed reading the new version. I confess that I already read the first and maybe the second version, and I see the evolution of the paper. So it's nice to see that you are making a lot of progress here.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so this paper contributes to the growing literature on, let's say, the effect of weather shocks on mobility. And clearly there are lots of studies, of case studies, I would say, focusing on this issue and finding very heterogeneous results. So the migration responses can be positive or negative, which is usually explained by the combined or the opposing effects of droughts on incentives to migrate and financial constraints. And what Luis and Catherine are doing in this paper is to show that the changes in incentives and constraints are closely connected with local marriage institutions. And this leads to very heterogeneous migration responses within the population, meaning that the average migration responses may hide huge differences across age and gender groups, a bit in line with what Michael Clemens said yesterday. So you focus on Malawi, which is a country where men have to pay a certain amount of money to the spouse family to secure a bride. And we clearly understand that in this context, an adverse economic shock can induce supply-side mechanisms and demand-side mechanisms. So on the supply side, the negative income shock can push the girl's family to sell their daughter more quickly or at a lower price. And on the demand side, men may have less to offer on the marriage market. So you use a quasi-experimental setting, relying on the fact that households are heterogeneously exposed to droughts, and you confirm that mobility responses are varying a lot across groups. So to me, this is a paper which is not only a contribution to the growing literature on migration responses to weather shocks, but it also conveys a very important message for migration scholars. We should include more ingredients from family economics in general. You are not the only one to do that. Maybe the next paper by Simone is doing the same thing. But clearly in approaches that use more quantitative theory, calibration, microfoundation, we should do it more as well. And we should deal with marriage institutions. So the fact that you have a polygamous versus monogamous regime, the fact that you have brides and dowries, the fact that you have assortative matching or skill mix within couple, these are very important ingredients, let's say, that determine the motive, the size, and the structure of migration. So first, I have a couple of clarification questions, things that you might want to improve to make the exposition clearer. You distinguish between two types of migration in this paper. I understand very well what between district migration means, but you should be a bit clearer about what within district migration means. Is it the fact that people are crossing the street to change residence or move to the village next door? So is it basically a paper on marriage or a paper on migration? Maybe you can think about putting a minimal distance to define what a migration spell would mean. The second thing is that in the paper, you should also clarify the time horizon that you are considering and the time structure. I understand that you have 4 waves in the survey, which allow you to identify the timing of mobility. So you know who is moving and when they moved. But in the paper, it's very unclear how you use that and what is the sample that you use in the regression. And you have been much clearer in the presentation. So I understood now that my guess was right. So your regression sample starts from 2000 and goes to 2016 on a yearly basis, I would say. So a few questions. What about those who migrated before 2000? Do you exclude them? Do you disregard the fact that they already migrated? While we know that when you have migrated once, it affects your propensity to migrate more. And you may also want to clarify the sample size that you are using. So I saw that in one of your tables, if you aggregate the 4 waves, you have about 180,000 interviewees. So you cover more or less 16 years. Of course, not all the years are leading to the same number of observations. So for the first wave, 2004, you can only cover 5 years of migration. But when you aggregate all these waves, you end up with something like 2 million year times individual pairs. And I see that in your most comprehensive tables, you use only 300K observations. So you may want to clarify this a bit. Does it matter if the drought happened during the crop growing season or the harvest season? Something you may also want to elaborate a bit on. And what about repeat movers? So people who migrated several times during that time horizon. So you might want to say a bit more on this. Second set of comments, maybe you could elaborate a bit on the interpretation of some results. So to me, you have these interactions between age and drought. So you have a direct effect of drought, which affect the reference group, which is the group age 48 to 57. And then you have interactions between the drought dummy and the other age groups. So it seems that the effect for the reference group is usually significant and negative, while for the other group, when you combine the direct impact and the interaction term, you have something which is significant at the confidence level of 90%, but my guess is that it's not significant at the 95% level. So maybe you can comment a bit about the significance of these effects for the other group. And to come back to the reference group, I was really surprised that there was an effect on marriage-driven mobility for a group of people who was so old, basically. So maybe you could say a bit more on remarriage institutions. Do you have many divorces? I saw that in the data from Malawi, about 1/4 of marriages are ending up with divorce. And what do widows become when their husband is passing away? Last thing about the interpretation of the results, you make a difference between a small shock, a moderate shock, and a big shock, 1 standard deviation versus 2 standard deviations, and you disregard completely the role that the repetition and the accumulation of shocks can have on migration decisions. So the fact that you experience several shocks during several years might also be a key determinant. And finally, you understand that what I like very much in your paper is the fact that you include some family economics ingredients. Maybe you could be a bit more precise about that and go further in emphasizing the role of family economics and marriage institutions concept. So you treat men and women decisions completely independently. What about household decisions or households in which you have two movers? So typically of situations in which the marriage and economic motives could be combined. Second thing, when you focus on men, I see that the marriage-driven mobility responses are nil below age 28, while they are positive above 28. This is what figure three is showing. So is there a difference here which could be explained by monogamous versus polygamous marriages, knowing that in polygamous marriages you have a difference between the age of the husband and the age of the wife in general? And finally, you put a lot of emphasis on gender and age, but I guess that marriage institutions are likely to affect people very differently according to their wealth or according to education of the father or the household head. So is it something that you could also explore? I'm done.
Thank you, Frederick. We are slowly running out of time. So, Luis, if you can just respond in 1 minute, please, because we need to end the session sharply at 1.
Yeah, I understand, but thank you so much, Frederick. I think I will appreciate if you can send me the slides. And just a few clarifications. Yeah, it's true that there is a good point about the repetition of shocks matter. That's something that I saw at some point. Those that migrated several times, actually we exclude, but there were just a few cases, but we exclude them. And yeah, that's another good point about remarriage institutions, and which is something that we should try to study a little bit more. And it's also true what you mentioned, that men and women, the relationships at the level, men and women inside the household are not independent. And we tried to do something using some when the whole household migrated, but it was no particular results at all. And probably one of the problems of the paper is that we don't have a really good information at the level of district of origin. So once they move, it's difficult to observe this kind of characteristics. For example, if they were wealthier or more educated, so they have, for example, siblings. I think for Amaretutana, that's gonna keep it for now, but we can talk more later on.
Okay, great. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Frederick. So the last presentation is by Simone Bertoli. Just a quick announcement. Simone's father is actually watching this, and I've been thinking really hard how to embarrass Simone, and I can't find a way. And I tried really hard, but just wanted to greet Bertoli Senior and tell him that Simone is an amazing academic, an amazing friend, and he's been part of this conference series for the last 13 years when he was a student first, and now he was one of the linchpins. So Simone, is that embarrassing enough? You're muted, Simone. You're muted.
And
So.
side, thanks to all of you for having me here. So what I'm presenting today is joint work with Elsa Gautran and Lili Morat, who are both online. And we're going to analyze the relationship between changing living arrangements and the effects of migration on the left behind in Mexico. So what is the starting point of our work? Is a simple observation that typically the economic literature analyzes the effect of migration or remittances on the left behind, assuming that their living arrangements remain unchanged after the departure of one household member. But the plausibility of this assumption is actually questionable, especially when international migration implies a prolonged period of separation for a married couple. So we want to address two questions in these. Left behind adjust their living arrangements, and does this matter for our own understanding of the effects produced by migration and remittances on them? And we're gonna focus on Mexico to analyze these two research questions for two reasons. First, we already know from the literature that partly because of legal restriction and the risks and costs associated to migration, Mexican migration to the United States typically occurs in stages, with married men migrating first, leaving behind their wives and children. Second, for this particular origin country, there's an abundant selection of papers analyzing the effects of migration on the left behind. And we're going to draw on a to analyze the implications of changes in living arrangements. So we already know from a recent JDE paper that I wrote with Eli that households of origin of the migrants are more likely to experience further variations in their composition. So more likely to receive new members, more likely to lose an additional member within Mexico. But unfortunately, because of data constraints, we were not able to characterize how their living arrangements are actually changing, because most of the action was related to attrition. So the household of origin of the migrant dropping out of the sample, so we no longer know what happens to them afterwards. So if we go back to married couples, we don't know yet how the migration of the husband, who typically occurs first, as I was saying, influences the evolution of the living arrangements of his own household of origin. So we want to understand how migration enters into the picture of the typical evolution of living arrangements for married couples in Mexico. Mexico is traditionally a patrilocal country, meaning that upon marriage, a married couple tends to live with the parents of the husband. After a few years, the couple typically becomes neolocal, so it sets up an independent housing unit. Matrilocality, meaning cohabitation with the parents of the wife, is rather infrequent for married couples, while it's much more common after marital dissolution. So with former wives or widows, for instance, joining the households of their own parents. So if you think about migration, you can think of two contrasting effects on living arrangements. First, you could think about the income effect, so resources flowing in through migrants' remittances that could actually foster and accelerate the transition from patrilocality to neolocality. But you could also see migration simply as a form of separation, although a very peculiar one. So thus potentially pushing wives to follow the typical living arrangement of former wives and widows, meaning matrilocality, co-residence with their own parents. If we look at anthropological and sociological accounts of the influence exerted by international migration on family structure in Mexico, they typically suggest that the latter is the case. So a lot of wives left behind, together with their children, join the households of their own parents, going against the traditional patrilocal norm in Mexico. And so what we do in our paper, we have a twofold contribution. We analyze the living arrangements of the wives left behind by international migrants using data from 3 distinct surveys. I will explain why. And then we describe the implications of the changes that we're going to uncover in the data for 2 influential papers that analyze the effect of migration and remittances on the left behind. So one by Franziska Antman, published on JD in 2011, and the other one published 1 year later, still on JD, by Alcaraz, Chiquiar, and Salcedo. So, preview of the results, we find a very high incidence of matrilocality among wives left behind by Mexican international migrants. And this high incidence doesn't reflect selection into migration on previous living arrangements, but rather changes intervening after the husband has left Mexico. And if we disregard, if we don't consider these changes, we can very likely overestimate the negative short-run effects of paternal migration on children and hide the relevant heterogeneity in the effects of remittances on children again, which challenges the conclusion that the drop in remittances analyzed by Alcaraz did not reduce school attendance among Mexican children left behind. So which are the 3 data sources? So the first one is a survey conducted by the National Statistical Institute in Mexico in 2016 on the relationship within the household with a focus on women. So the Endire survey. And this is the first time that this survey is used in the migration literature, right? I'll tell you why. So within each household, a woman age 15 and above is randomly selected for an in-depth interview. And the content of the in-depth interview depends on her marital status. We're going to focus on married, and in free union women, and we're gonna call them married for short. And married women declare whether they co-reside with their own husbands, and very importantly for us, where the husband lives in case of non-co-residence. This is a key feature of this survey. This allows identifying the wives left behind by international migrants who have moved to the United States. We also have information of their living arrangements, not only at the time of the survey, but also at the time in which they got married. So we know whether they were patrilocal, neolocal, or matrilocal to begin with. The second survey is more standard, is the NOI, the same data source that we use with Eli in the JD paper. This is a short rotating panel survey that follows households for up to 5 consecutive quarters, and it allows identifying the occurrence of migration episodes out of variations in the household roster from one interview to the next. Last but not least, the extended, the large survey connected to the 2010 Mexican population census, which was administered to 10% of the Mexican population, so around 3 million households. These surveys contains question on marital status, co-residence with the spouse and with the parents, retrospective questions on migration, and the receipt of remittances from abroad. But differently from the NDIRE, in case of non-co-residence, we don't know, there's no explicit question about where your husband is currently living, something that will force us to rely on a proxy, as I will explain in a while. So using the NDIRE, what we do is we try to build up a very simple stylized FAT comparing the living arrangements of what we call stayers, so wives that are co-residing with their husbands in Mexico, and left behind, so wives of international migrants. We have more than 48,000 stayers in the sample and a bit more than 600 wives left behind. Skipping descriptives. What I'm plotting here against the age of the wife in 5-year age group on the horizontal axis is the incidence of patrilocality for women living in urban areas, so co-residence with their in-laws. And the line that you see is the figure for stayers. If we consider left behind, there's not much action. The share of patrilocality among the left behind is comparable to the one of the stayers, even though a bit lower in the first 2 age groups. If I repeat the same exercise for matrilocality, the picture is dramatically different. So on average, the incidence of matrilocality among the wives left behind is 4 times higher than the corresponding incidence among the stayers. And if I focus, for instance, on the first age group, 20 to 24, median age at marriage in Mexico is 20. The incidence of matrilocality among stayers, so non-migrants, is 16%, and it goes up to 64% among the wives left behind. Of course, there can be different and non-mutually exclusive explanations for this pattern. So we might think that it's all an issue of selection into migration on the basis of previous living arrangements. But if you look at the NDIRE, we see that the wives left behind had actually a higher probability to be patrilocal as opposed to matrilocal at the time of the wedding. We drew on the data from the NOE to see whether living arrangements had already changed in between the time of the wedding and the time in which we observe in the NOI the husband migrating, but this is not the case. The probability that the husband leaves Mexico is similar for matrilocal and patrilocal couples. So it's likely that what we observe in the data in the NDIRE reflects changes intervening after the migration of the husband. And in order to prove this conjecture, we can draw on the data from the 2010 Mexican census. This census contains the following question, which is gold standard in terms of retrospective questions on migration episodes. During the last 5 years, has any person who lives or lived with you in this housing unit gone to live in another country? The surveyed household says yes, then they record the name of the migrants, and then separately for each migrant, the enumerator asks a co-residence condition. When name of the migrant left for the last time, was he or she living with you? If this co-residence condition, which is meant to avoid double counting, is not satisfied, then the migration episode simply remains unrecorded. There's nothing in the flights. So we want to understand whether wives that are very likely to have been left behind by an international migrant are actually reporting their husband as a current migrant or not because of the violation of the co-residence condition. So how do we do so? We focus on a sample of almost 28,000 women aged 20 to 49, as in the Ndire, that are very likely to have been left behind by a migrant husband because they are married. They tell us that they are not co-residing with their husbands, and they belong to a remittance recipient household. Or we also have a robustness where we focus on the women that personally say, I do receive remittances from abroad. And then we search in the set of possibly empty set of international migrants reported by these households, whether we can find a man that's likely to be her husband. So someone whose age is in the range that is likely to characterize a marital relationship. So we search for a migrant that is no more than 40 years younger and no more than 9 years older than the wife in question. Only for 41% of the women that are likely to have been left behind, we are able to find their husband among the migrants, but this clearly is not necessarily related to the fact that they have changed their living arrangements after migration. It could be due to the fact that the husband migrated before the 5-year recall period, or it might be deliberate misreporting. They're simply lying, something that is not uncommon in Mexico when it comes to international migration. So what we do is to estimate a regression where the dependent variable is a dummy that tells us whether the husband of each wife is enumerated as an international migrant or not, and the variable of interest are variables that describe living arrangements. And what we see is that wives left behind that co-reside with their own parents are significantly less likely than neolocal or local wives to report the migration of their husbands. So it's for instance, for neolocal women in the entire country, the probability of reporting the migration of the husband is 53%, but for a matrilocal woman, this goes down to 25%. So it's a substantial reduction in the probability of enumerating that is likely to be related to the fact that changes in living arrangements led to a violation of the co-residence condition that is used in the census. So this suggests that changes in living arrangements occurred after the migration of the husband. So the pattern that we observe in Ndire reflects changes intervening after the migration of the husband. Clearly, this not just applies to the wives, but also to their children, who are much more likely to co-reside with maternal grandparents than children of co-resident couples, so children of stayers. So why should this matter at all for us, migrant scholars? Well, if we have changes in living arrangements intervening after the migration of the husband, this creates analytical challenges both for surveys that employ retrospective questions, because the co-residence condition is going to be violated, but also, yes, Charlotte, fine, but also for panel surveys, because if you move to a different housing unit, you join the household of your parents, this is going to induce attrition and you drop out of the sample. In both cases, the sample of left behind identified in cross-sectional surveys or in panel surveys is going to miss individuals who modified their living arrangements. However, different living arrangements can mediate the effects of migration or remittances on the left behind. Why? Because you can think that they're going to modify the information asymmetry between the two spouses. They're going to influence the bargaining power of the wife with respect, for instance, to the use of remittances. Or you could think of the investment of grandparents in grandchildren, their grandchildren. Think about the paper by Duflo, who was interpreted by Cox and Fachamp as in terms of insights from evolutionary biology, maternal grandparents are more likely to invest in their grandchildren than paternal grandparents. So moving from patrilocality to matrilocality might not be immaterial. So to just give you a preview of the possible implications, we drew on the paper by Antman first, who analyzes the effect of paternal migration from a survey that is identical to the noise, so from variations in the household roster, on the time devoted to study and to work by the children left behind. Antman uses in the analysis only children that do not attrit, so that are observed throughout the 5 quarters in which their household is followed. And she also focuses only on children of the household head. So most households in her sample are neolocal to begin with. But attrition is a big issue. She's actually losing 61% of treated children, so children whose fathers migrated out of Mexico. And this share is more than twice as large as the corresponding share for untreated children, so children whose father didn't migrate. So this is consistent with our story. There's a move towards matrilocality that induces attrition. She finds very negative short-run effects, less time for study, more work of the treatment, something that she interprets as a temporary financial hardship induced by the household investment into the migration of the father. However, her analysis is by construction and informative about whether children who join the household of maternal grandparents actually experience different short-run effects. Because we could think that joining the household of the grandparent was a way to mitigate or possibly offset the temporary financial hardship. Very briefly on Alcaraz, Chiker, and Salcedo, this is a well-known paper. They analyzed whether the economic crisis in the United States that led to a dramatic drop in the probability that the recipient household in Mexico was still receiving remittances 1 year after the beginning of the crisis. They're going to analyze how this influences school attendance and child work for children in recipient households. The basic message that I would like to convey is that we have analyzed the same data used in this paper, and the living arrangements of children in remittance recipient households are radically different from the living arrangements of children in non-recipient households. So in urban areas in Mexico, the share of recipient children that co-reside with their grandparents is 30.6%, much higher than the 13% that we observe for non-recipients. We redo their diff-in-diff analysis, splitting the sample on the basis of the living arrangements. If we pool all children together, we replicate their result, which is there's no effect of this dramatic drop in remittances on school attendance. And this absence of effect in urban areas holds also a new instrument for the recipient status in Alcaraz, Chiken, and Salcedo. But actually, we do see that the children who were not co-residing with their grandparents did experience a significant reduction in their probability of attending school, while indeed co-residing with maternal grandparents softened the negative effect of this decline in remittance income. So there's a relevant heterogeneity. It seems that co-residing with grandparents is protecting the children. There's nothing causal here. It might just be that co-residence is the strength of the connection within the extended family. I'm not claiming causality, I'm just showing a relevant heterogeneity that I think is worth thinking about. And also, if you go back to Antman, you might think that just focusing on children that remain in a nuclear household is probably lead to an overestimation of the negative short-run effects, as moving to a different household might have mitigated the negative effect of paternal migration. So I'm done. Beyond having my father online, which is great per se, I think that we can gain further insights if we intertwine more closely the migration literature with models of intra-household decision-making, find that migration itself is likely to reshape household composition and living arrangements. Thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you, Simone. We are now the last speaker of the conference. Mylis, are you there? We will have. Okay, you're muted.
Should be better.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so thanks a lot for nice to the paper of Simone to discuss. I apologize because many of the comments I have also are linked to the fact that I had only slides, so maybe it will limit the depth of what I can say. So I'm going to share. Okay. So I'm trying to find how I can share the slides of my discussion.
So on the top there's a share. Do you see share on the next
so
to?
I should put my
You can say
file.
share content.
Okay, I got it.
Mhm.
Okay, so do you have the slide?
Yes, but upside down, sideways.
So okay, I don't know why. I think I can share my screen as well, no?
Yes.
Yes.
I will do that. Sure. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we see. Yep. Perfect.
Okay. So I'm going to. I will try to be quick, given the short time. So the paper by Simone, Alza Gautrin, and Elie Murat is a great paper. I mean, a great idea on an important topic. Migration indeed affects household composition, and the resulting attrition is usually not that considered. Households dissolve, and the left behind may join other households. So it's interesting per se. So the stylized fact is not surprising. You can expect women home with her kid to move to her parents' place rather to her in-laws' place. But it has very interesting implications when it comes to the bargaining power of the women. It also has a big implication when you assess the effect of migration on left behind. So I have first a point to make about measurement. So the first question is, to what extent is attrition a problem for the attrition story of the paper, as 15% of migrant women in the US actually have left behind their husbands. And I have also a point to make about the census question. I've been discussing with Simone about that a few hours ago, but I was not still quite clear about that point. So the main questions are whether during the last 5 years, any person who lived with you in this housing unit has gone to live in another country. And then when the migrant left for the last time, was she living with you again? So the question is, what is with you? Is it the household? Is it the person who are in the housing unit? Or is it only the housing unit? And obviously, with a group of people living in the house might be subject to interpretation according to whether the wife responds. If it's the wife, we can expect her to answer yes to the first question. But if it's not, and to the contrary, if the interpretation will be rather was living with your respondent rather than within the house, then a no to the question about the co-residence question might not imply actually that the husband migrated before the wife moved to her mother's place. You could imagine that the wife, before she moved to her parents' place after the husband migrating, but then she was living with him when he migrated. Then she should say that she was living with him at the time of migration. The dummy about the non-enumeration could also capture something else, as divorce, husband's death, migration spell within Mexico before migration to the US, and this should be discussed. And the main answer could be to interact multi-locality with wife is a respondent. And last, something that could be done is also to look at households who receive remittances and report no migrants versus the households who report migrants. And then the magnitude of the figures could actually help the reader to convince about the interpretation. So then if the left behind wife is more likely to live with their own parents, is it really an effect of migration? Are we capturing something else? It could be that husband parents are more likely to have passed away, that the husband parents may have moved. So for that, it's interesting to know also the place of birth of both husband and wife. And then the birth rank and siblings number of both husband and spouse should matter. Obviously, if you have many kids who have been migrating abroad as parents, you may not welcome everyone under your roof. As for the implications, we lose track of many left behind who are better off than the one we keep in a panel. So Simone has been already said what implies for some important papers in the literature. And we also lose track of left behind who are worse off, like single mother living on their own. So this should be also discussed. But more generally, it implies that households who are not considered as impacted by migration also are actually impacted, as they host the migrant's wife them. So it's to further to extend what's the implication of the paper by Simone. It might bring economy of scales, help for household scores, for agricultural work, for remittances, for you can also think about behavioral change. So these are like many research avenues that are impacted. And then hosting the left behind might also be desirable. It might be something both sides fight for. And of course, it would be very interesting to connect these results with like family economics. And a last point to make, to go beyond, in the census, you could also look at the non-enumeration of all the sons who have migrated. So not only looking at the wife of potential migrants, but also the parents of potential migrants. You could look at internal migrants, as you might expect similar patterns. You could find also left behind in panel surveys as new members in their households, though it might be tricky. Look at other data to explore implications related to bargaining power or violence, because you might expect the wife living with her paternal or with her in-laws to be more subject to some violence. And also connect with what's happening on marriage markets. Some recent papers have shown that it's sometimes as a result of immigration enforcement, you might have like the marriage market is changing. You might have more migrant citizen marrying with US citizens. And obviously it's of interest in many other contexts. We can think of like many examples in China where actually paternal grandparents are expected to take care of their son rather than maternal grandparents. So as a result, they receive less remittances for that. You can think about Nepal, actually, where the husband might secretly hide and send remittances to his wife, so to avoid his own parents to actually capture to actually capture the remittances. Okay, you can think of other countries. I would think it would be for many of the literature on migration to extend the topic. I'm done.
Thanks, Melis. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Simone, you want to take like 2 minutes to respond because we are out of time and I'm not
even less.
Get away from.
Grateful to Melis, especially because her work was very hard, given that we only sent her an extended version of the slides. So thanks a lot, Melis. You did a great job. So I do believe that this is relevant also in other contexts. Especially, I think it would be very nice to analyze the implication to see whether this story holds also in countries where you have a much higher prevalence of women migration. So women migrating independently of their husbands. Think about the Philippines. Because as Marcel Fachon put it in one of his handbook chapter, in a lot of developing countries, an household without a woman is simply not viable. So you would expect that probably there's even more action there. So I totally agree that we need to look back into the answers to the 2010 census. And if you can send me the slide, Elsa, Elie, and I would be more than happy to exchange with you further on a bilateral basis.
I will.
Okay, guys, I think we're done. And I want to thank everybody, the presenters, the discussants, and sticking to time almost. We did great. So we're going to have the closing session. It's in another room, so we're going to close this session and please go to that room. I'm assuming everybody has the link, and I'll see you in the other room in 1 minute.
Thanks.
Thank you.